Welcome to episode 6, and this week we're reading from chapter 6 verse 27 through to chapter 8 and verse 3. Last week we met the first disciples, the followers of Jesus, which sounds like a super serious specialist thing, but all people in the world follow someone or live for something that defines and organises their lives. And as we finish this block of teaching that we began last week, Jesus asks a serious question about that. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. In other words, the vital question is, where does the thing we follow or live for ultimately take us? What kind of world does it create? And that's a question that's usually easier to ask of others, but Jesus says we should always start with ourselves. Jesus wants us to build lives that endure for eternity, and so he tells the parable of the wise and foolish builders, which asks, what are you building your life upon? It's not that there aren't good and wise things in the world, but which of any of them will last forever? Later in Luke, Jesus will say, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. God's word, which includes what Jesus says, are the only truths that we can build our lives upon that have a promise of lasting forever. Two miracles follow, but first, just to note, chapter 7 verse 1 mentions the town of Capernaum. So to say, during this period of his ministry, this fishing town on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee became something of a home base, and many events take place around here. Here he meets a centurion in great need. So let's note two things about him. First, he's not Jewish, but he is a follower of the God of the Old Testament and has even funded a synagogue. This is the ruin of a later synagogue from a few hundred years later, but it gives you an idea. Back in chapter 4, Jesus mentioned some Old Testament miracles that happened to non-Jews. And here's another happening to a Gentile who has, however, recognized Jesus as sent from God with authority. So then Jesus goes from this respected public figure to the other end of the spectrum, a widow who has lost her only son. Jesus intervenes and raises him, and they call Jesus a great prophet. So as we said a couple of weeks ago, the miracles point to a different kind of world and to Jesus as the one who can open the door to it. Verses 18 to 35 describe John the Baptist asking if Jesus is indeed the long-expected one. Now, we don't know exactly why he asks this, because he already knew. There are a couple of theories, but the point here is Jesus basically says, look at the evidence, I'm doing all the things only God's Son could do, and draw a conclusion. And in a way, that's what Luke is asking us to do, which should be straightforward, but the human heart isn't, which is why there's this curious warning in verses 31 to 35. The fact is, it's possible to make up your mind beforehand and simply keep asking for evidence with no intention of forming a conclusion. The children's rhyme illustrates that John came with one style and the authorities rejected him. Jesus comes with a different style and they rejected him too. They weren't really making an honest inquiry, and with eternity at stake, it's really important that we do. And finally, chapter 7, verse 36 through to 8:3. I'd love to pause here because this is one of the most moving stories in the gospel. But we have time for just one point to consider. An excluded woman defies every social convention to reach the Jesus who had forgiven her, and then a group of women who follow and support him. Religion can be portrayed as very negative for women, in good measure because of times and places where that has been the case. But it's important to separate historical aberrations from what Jesus was actually about. And you might say, well, you're a man, you would say that. Well, okay, fair point. But then I'd say, well, listen to the women who met Jesus here and in the following generations. Because Christianity was not viewed negatively by them. By the 2nd century, the estimated gender representation in the church was 2/3 women to 1/3 men, which is big. But then consider the Roman world was estimated to be 2/3 men to 1/3 women. Proportionally, the Christian faith was hugely attractive to women. And that starts with Jesus. Here are some questions that might help with your reading this week. Question 1. If we committed to following Jesus' teaching in chapter 6, 27 to 42, what kind of world would we create? Question 2. Honestly assess what you've seen so far in Luke's Gospel. Who do you think Jesus is? Is his teaching attractive? Which parts do you find personally challenging? Question 3. In chapter 7, verse 36 to 50, why does this woman pour out her emotions to Jesus? How do Jesus' words help us to understand what is going on? Thanks for being with us again. Hope to see you next week, next Friday.